to 53. I think we'll, just at a couple of minutes past 7, I think we might as well kick off. So first of all, what I'd like to do is just introduce everyone to the event this evening. My name's Neil Redfern. I'm the Executive Director of the Council for British Archaeology, and we've been really pleased to publish the 2 volumes on Forteviot and to bring our authors and funders together to actually give us an insight to what creating these volumes was actually like. So I'm hugely grateful to all the authors who will get a chance to introduce themselves shortly, and I'd really like to thank Becky Jones at Historic Environment Scotland, who helped us fund the printing of the publication and putting it together, which is absolutely fantastic. What I absolutely love, we're looking at CBA reports 176 and 177. So they come in a long line of really excellent publishing that we've done over the years, and they're just a fantastic addition. So I hope you all get a chance to get hold of your copies. Just so you know, we will be putting up a discount code for you. So if you haven't got a copy yet, okay, if you type in the discount code Forteviot21, you can get a 10% discount on either one of the volumes. Or if you're really feeling slightly flush and type in 2 Forteviot, you can get a 15% discount on both editions of the publication, which is fantastic. My colleague Claire, who's hiding in the background, is going to put all that information in the chat, so you'll get an email, so you can actually see that in the chat and actually note that down. We are all going to email you all tomorrow as well, and we will repeat those codes and give you the access to our web shop where you can actually go and purchase the books. And we'll send you, obviously, I've got to do this bit, a little bit more information about how, if you enjoy this, you can become a member of the Council for British Archaeology and get lots more access to these sorts of events. We're really pleased to actually be working and publishing this volume in Scotland. And obviously, I would just like to shout out to Archaeology Scotland, who are our sort of sister organisation in Scotland, who do fantastic work. So I do slightly feel that I'm treading on their toes, but we do have a great working relationship. And I just want to just really shout out, if you're interested in getting involved in archaeology, yes, you can come to the CBA, but don't forget Archaeology Scotland, who do equally brilliant work north of the border for us. Okay, really fantastic stuff. So just a bit of chatter rules. We've turned all your cameras off. We've turned all your microphones off. So we're going to leave it like that because this is a panel discussion between the panelists. We do want to hear your questions, however. So we'd like you to use the chat function or the Q&A function. And what I'll be doing again is hiding in the background, helping collate some of those questions so that we can actually bring those to the panelists at the end of their initial discussion. What I ask you, if you've got a question and you know your question, start typing now, okay? Because it takes longer to type a question than it does to actually ask a question. So again, we want lots of questions at the end, so it'll be great if you get on with that now. So without further ado, what I would like to do is introduce Dr. Sally Foster from the University of Stirling, who's actually going to chair our panel and get these amazing speakers interacting with each other and actually bouncing off each other and really giving us some great insight into what they actually got up to at Forteviot. So Sally, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I know they'll have lots and lots to say. So yeah, so I'm the master of ceremonies, so to speak, and it's my pleasure just to give us all the opportunity to learn more about these wonderful books, these beautifully crafted books. And this is research that transforms our understanding of Scotland's place in the world. And I think I should just flag, I'm sure that our panelists all wanted it, but the artists, David Simon and Alice Waterson, really deserve special credit, I think, because these books are splendid and are exceptional value. So we've got a series of questions that we're going to explore, and it's my job really just to try and make sure we get through and cover all those issues. But to begin with, our panelists are all going to introduce themselves, starting with Steve. Stephen Driscoll.
Hello, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Stephen Driscoll. I'm Professor of Historical Archaeology at the University of Glasgow. And in some ways, this project is an outgrowth of my PhD research, which I did back in the first half of the 1980s. So there's a very long trajectory of exploration here behind it, and not just me, obviously, other people as well.
Kenny?
Hi, I'm Kenny Brophy. of Glasgow University. I'm currently the head of subject at Glasgow, which is still amazes me even now, a year after starting doing the job. Yeah, and my main role in the SERF project was to be managing the prehistoric side of things, but that was also meant that I was bouncing off colleagues who are medievalists, which is really energizing and exciting. And we ended up having to work on each other's sites to try and explain things that we were finding. So it was an incredible process and a fantastic experience to be involved in. So yeah, and also I love crop marks, which will probably become very clear as the evening goes on. And
you work with Gordon Noble, who has sent his apologies for tonight. Ewan.
Hello, Ewan Campbell. I'm a senior lecturer in archaeology at University of Glasgow, and I'm helped direct several of the excavations and be part of the project throughout its whole life, which has been wonderful to be out in the field in Scottish summer throughout this period, throughout these 10 years. And just say the same as Kenny and Steve, it's been great to work with colleagues in different disciplines and have a good creative interplay with these people from different sides of archaeology.
Thanks, Becky.
Hi, I'm Becky Jones. I feel like the fraud in the pack here because I didn't dig or work at SERF, but I head up the Archaeology and World Heritage team at Historic Environment Scotland, and we've been one of the principal funders of the project, and I've visited the excavations numerous times, and in fact both my children did their first dig on various SERF projects as well.
Thank you. And last but very definitely not least, given what she did in this project, Tessa.
Hi, yes, I'm Tessa Polar, and I am a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, and I directed the Hillfort excavations that sort of sat alongside the focus of Forteviot, which is for tonight, but also managed the project from 2009, so helped to make things hopefully go smoothly as best as possible.
Definitely made everything go. I think I speak for everybody when I say that. So thank you very much, team, panelists. We'll now move on to some deep time dialogue and reflections on the SERF project. So we've got a series of questions. One person's going to kick off responding, and then other people are going to chip in, and I'm going to keep an eye on the time. So to kick off, to quote Nick Evans in Volume 2, which is Royal Forteviot, in the 19th century, Forteviot was described as a quaint footnote in the Scottish national narrative. So how, given your findings, should we now regard Forteviot, and why does that matter? So the aim here is to get a kind of little bit of an overview, a sense of why this is all important, and I've asked Ewan to kick off with this question.
Hi, thanks, Sally. Well, Forteviot turns out to be probably the most important site in Scotland for the development, illustrating the development of the Scottish kingdom, the medieval kingdom of Alba and later the kingdom of Scotland. And it's important because it illustrates the process of how that development took place from, if you like, prehistoric kin-based societies, kings of small groups of peoples, and moved from that to the idea of a king of a land. So we move from the kings of the Dalriada or the Picts to the kings of Alba, a place. And how this actually worked in practice is something we can see happening at Forteviot. And what we see happening there is that a king, possibly Kenneth MacAlban, but probably more likely Constantine MacFergus in the early 9th century, chooses this site as for a new type of royal centre, a centre which has a royal residence and a major ecclesiastical establishment. But he sites it within this prehistoric monumental complex, and not just a monumental complex which had existed thousands of years ago, but one which had continued to be important to people in the area, because we found from our excavations that all sorts of activities were going on within these prehistoric monuments during, say, the 4th to the 8th or 9th centuries, including burial monuments being erected around the prehistoric sites, but also interventions within the prehistoric monuments, for example, digging large pits in the centres of the henge monuments, digging out Bronze Age kists and putting early medieval cremated material in them, digging out prehistoric artifacts and depositing them in their graves, and practices, strange practices such as cremation in the 8th or early 9th century in what was very much a Christian community still taking place in this area. So it was clearly a special and different place, and it was being appropriated by this new type of king. And by citing a royal residence and with an ecclesiastical establishment, it was mirroring things which were happening in the continent, for example, with Charlemagne's palace church complex at Aachen, clearly trying to bring this kingdom within the scope of continental practices. And so we can see a start here to the whole practice of medieval kingship in Scotland, which moves on from Fortevet to Scone, which also has a church, but doesn't have the major prehistoric monuments, and then into the full medieval period where the prehistoric aspect of this disappears entirely. But Fortevet's really important, and not just for Scotland, but for the rest of Britain as well, as illustrating a stage of how this transformation from kin-based societies to medieval states began to take place.
Anybody else wants to chip in, just please do.
Well, on you go, Kenny.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I always reflect on for the excavating at Fortevet was how annoyed I was at the early medieval people who insisted in digging giant holes in the middle of henges and almost certainly obscuring relationships, removing material, and probably taking away burial remains, beakers, all sorts of things that would have been fun to find. So it was always a source of frustration that every henge, I mean, there's 4 henges that we know of at Fortevet, all crop mark sites, and all have got these enormous holes in the middle. And the 2 we excavated were the early medieval holes, and I'm sure the other 2 are the same. So there was real frustration. But in terms of the status of Fortevet, for me, actually, the early medieval stuff is really fascinating. But Fortevet was also one of the preeminent power centres in prehistoric Britain. And I mean, it's a cliche to say this, but if these monuments were made of stone, they would be World Heritage sites. They would be internationally famous, and they'd be well-known monuments. But because they're crop mark sites, they are a footnote. And even if you look at the literature about the British Neolithic, Fortevet was barely mentioned until the last decade when we started to do the excavations there, which is often the fate of crop mark sites. So I think it's also got this incredible significance to the extent that it probably mirrors the Stonehenge landscape with the Fortevet enclosure and the enclosure just down the river at Ledketty, which mirrors to me Stonehenge and Durrington Walls connected by a river relationship. So it's absolutely up there as a preeminent power centre in northwestern Europe. And it's the first incarnation, never mind the incredible later stuff that Ewan was talking about.
Kenny, could you just say a little bit more about how you justify that observation, that statement about it being this preeminent?
I mean, for me, it's about the longevity of how long things were happening there, how long this retained significance. There's sort of 2 main periods of late Neolithic cremation and then the early Bronze Age dagger burial, which are more or less 1,000 years apart, but yet located 5 meters apart on the ground. And both of which are really significant discoveries. It's the Neolithic cremation cemeteries, one of the biggest found in Britain out with Stonehenge, and I'm fairly sure that there was a lot more to be found there if it hadn't been dug out by the early medieval people, as I've said. So I think you've got this concentration of really high status and significant and interesting and weird activity going on over an extended period of time, and you've also got the monumentality. Fortevet itself is this enormous palisaded enclosure, 250 meters in diameter, defined by oak posts that could have been up to 8 meters long. And that's David Simon's reconstruction. And all those little tiny shapes in the middle are not ants, they're actually people congregating inside the monument. So you've got this enormous enclosure, but then at Ledketty, you've got the same thing, 4 kilometers away. So within this small area, you've got 2 monuments that represent enormous transformations of the landscape and huge investments in labor, time, resources over extended periods of time, probably very important pilgrimage sites. So there's a lot of stuff that comes together to make me think that, you know, there's very few other places in Britain that are on a par with with all of those different elements of the prehistoric incarnation of Fertiviat.
Steve, you wanted to say something?
I was just going to say, in terms of trying to understand where it is, I mean, it's very central on the east coast of Scotland, and it's alongside major routeways, that overland routeways. Really, it's not really. I mean, it is connected by water, but it's really the way in which people have kind of moved to this landscape, and Fertiviat seems to be at a place which is pretty well connected and pretty well serviced by roads going back into the Roman period and presumably earlier. But But
that's happening in the south of Scotland, or more or less the south of Scotland rather than the north, because you could say there are, broadly speaking, comparable nodal points wherever elsewhere in Scotland. So why in this particular bit of Scotland in this period, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to the Neolithic people. You know, they have it for whatever reason that they latched onto this place. The extraordinary thing is, people don't really forget about it. You know, it's for generation upon generation, it retains its importance. And, you know, one of the things we've kind of come to understand is that there's a curation process going on here about retaining a site and not losing sight of it. And partially it's because there are these big earthworks as well as the timber structures, which are part of it. So, but we're pretty certain that one of the reasons why it's visible and recognized and not lost until the later medieval period is because it's being grazed, so the monuments are visible, so people know where it is. So people, even when they're not maybe doing very much in terms of architectural effort, in terms of building stuff, it's still there and they still know about it. So that was quite interesting to us, and to think about how that idea of grazing and keeping livestock and maybe important, you know, kind of gatherings of large herds and as part of a kind of status display, that might all be tied together here.
Between us, you've given us a great sense of why it's really important, why it's exceptional, why it actually matters. And what emerges is that, you know, the crop marks are what would have drawn you all to this place. And we got a sense, Steve, from you of how you've had a long history of kind of engagement with this place and the crop marks. I think now is probably quite a good time to move on to think about the royal dimension of this, which is where Ewan started, and think about, you know, why does this project have such an emphasis on royalty? And, you know, is this inevitable when you're dealing with, well, I'd say historical sites of this era? You just told us this site actually covers millennia, but, you know, your project itself, you know, did have a particular focus and arguably starting point with the early medieval period. So, Steve, I think that's one for you to.
Yeah, well, what I think, I mean, in a way, it's inevitable when you're dealing with these very early historical periods and sites for the visibility of royal sites to be incredibly prominent, because they're, you know, they get most of the press. You know, we have so few citations. What we have are about the great and the spectacular, and so they focus in on the nobility, on royalty. So, but I wouldn't say that we're particularly interested in if you like, in kind of charting the kind of the development of royalty as such, but more as a notion of the institutional notion, the idea, and Ewan was talking about this a little bit, this idea of how society is being governed and how that kind of the mechanisms for organizing and governing society are evolving and undergoing a very significant change at this moment. And one of the things, we have a few references, and one of them has this exceptional mention of a palace, you know, a unique reference to a palace. So at least in the middle of the 9th century, when Kenneth MacAlpin died in this palace, people were thinking that this is a really different kind of place. There aren't any other references to that. But the other point I would, you know, kind of make about the institution is that it's a kind of transformative point, you know, that it's a place which has this deep significance, but at some point, and we think around the year 800, you know, it is reinvented and reimagined as a place which is suitable for the inauguration of kings, and is suitable for maybe thinking about social organizations that are much bigger than they had been previously. And so that
you use the term, you talk about props and devices that are involved in this kind of reimagination, and the role that earlier landscape, well, the earlier landscape, but also the landscape they create. I mean, that massive transformation that takes.
I think that the things we could point to, I mean, this is where the sculpture kind of comes into its own, because we have this exceptional body of sculpture, a remarkable arch, which is in the National Museum, which has these classically garbed figures, which presumably comes from a chapel, something to do with the palace. It's not found in situ, so we're kind of speculating about that, but it is a remarkable thing. And then we have these some exceptional pieces of sculpture, including a cross which has an inscription with the name of this Pictish king who dies in 820, and who Ewan was just referring to, Constantine, son of Fergus, or Erguist, if you're kind of getting very Pictish about it. So, and he is a really important figure, and his successors are ruling the Rus for several generations afterwards. So they seem to mark this kind of transitional moment where it's a different concept of kingship, and there's a very clear kind of, or to my mind, it's a clear attempt to draw upon some of the glamour and that we associate with the Byzantine world, with Constantine, you know, so that it's quite a kind of aspirational kind of way in which these monuments have been deployed within this pre-existing landscape. You know, they must be there to shape and guide the kind of ceremonies and rituals which we must imagine.
Yeah, and it gives us a fantastic insight into the sort of the network of contacts and intellect, I suppose, of the people that we're actually dealing with as well. What about, though, this question of Irish royal site phenomena, and the question of are we any further in understanding the significance of this royal site for Teviot and the issue of Celtic kingship, specifically the Irish royal site phenomena, which you will need to explain to us. Don't know if that's a question for you or Ewan, but
I'll maybe he's pointed at me. Well, the idea that there are these special places where things can be made is very visible in the Irish historical literature, because we have these accounts of it, and what comes across is the places which are chosen have these really strong mythological backgrounds. They're very rich in monuments, and so there's a kind of sense that these are the sacredness of these places and the connectedness to a kind of ancestral world, that cosmology is kind of hardwired into these sites, because they're built with monuments to the ancestral dead and so on. So these become the kind of the setting and position in which the kind of rituals of kingship are taking place. And Fortivia, it fits that pattern in a way. You know, it has the henges, it has the barrows, it has all that. But the thing which really sets it apart is the idea that of the Christianization of this place, the idea of putting a chapel in there, the idea of putting what seems to be a permanent residence, and the idea of you know, all this Christian sculpture. So none of that sort of thing is a feature of the most of these Irish royal sites. The only one which is remotely like this is Cashel, and it has it actually doesn't have much of the obvious prehistoric monumentality, but most of the other places don't have the church. So there's something quite different happening here in Scotland. You know, that this idea of kind of utilizing that ancestral past, but also kind of presenting it as a kind of Christian landscape. It seems an important thing.
Thank you. No, that's great. Again, highlighting why what we're seeing here is so exceptional as well. We're going to move now. We need to move on to Kenny's favourite subject, which is crop marks. So I think, there's lots of lessons that emerge out of this project, but I mean, what I would like you to think about and tell us a little bit more about are the lessons for how we attribute value to our crop mark sites and how we actually act on that understanding of their significance, bearing in mind that they are essentially invisible things, and that you know, it might be very difficult for the public to recognise and appreciate, let alone us as archaeologists. And Kenny, and I'm guessing, Kenny, this is your words, you know, in the prehistoric Fortivia, you know, you state the excavations at Fortivia suggest crop mark scheduling advisory notes on their management are insufficient. I mean, what are the kind of key learning points you take from this, Kenny, for our heritage management practice and the values that we as society should be attaching to these crop marks?
Yeah, I mean, the crop marks are amazing things. You know, there's 10,000 archaeological sites in Scotland are discovered through crop marks, and almost no one ever looks at them or does anything with them because they're invisible, they're difficult to get to grips with. There's a sense that they're ruinous sites already. There's not much we can do with them. And Fortivia is a great example. I mean, I first visited Fortivia in 1994 when I was looking for undergraduate dissertation topics. And I remember walking into this field and just trying to imagine this enormous timber palisaded enclosure and all of the henges when there was nothing there. It was just a flat field. And that's something that fascinated me. And I did my PhD on Cursus monuments, which are very much the same kind of issues. And so there's definitely an issue about public perception. The public have a low awareness of crop marks. There was a lot of media coverage in the drought summer of 2018 where there was new sites discovered. People were finding crop marks using drones. You know, people can find them using Google Earth and things like that. So it's starting to open up a bit more to public interest, but there's definitely a lot more we could do to make people aware of crop marks and how magical they are. And I can't believe there hasn't been a BBC 4 series about them, frankly.
No, and you have a picture in the book which is really vivid, which is a young man, I think, standing in a furrow created by, you know, agricultural equipment, kind of going through these sites. So
yeah, that's my nephew.
Very vulnerable.
Yeah, that's my nephew Ryan as a scale. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing for Fortivia that's frightening is that you've got a site that we all agree here is a internationally important archaeological site, and every 5 years the farmer plants potatoes in the field, and the potato furrows are very deep, and yeah, as deep as Steve's torso. And at the end of the day, that there's nothing. The farmer isn't doing anything wrong. HES can't do anything about it because this is a historic process. But what's inevitably happening is that the site is being damaged by plough action. And the reason that we have such good survival at Fortivia is because the archaeology is so much depth. So the ditches in some places of the henge is over 2 meters deep. And it was also, there was a kind of a cap of rubble towards the top of the earthworks that was part of post-medieval levelling of the land, I think. So there's been an element of protection. But once you go on, take off the topsoil, you can see stones been bashed by ploughs, you know, things have been scraped through, and you've got, you know, cremation burials that are just a foot beneath the surface that will inevitably be damaged by future ploughing activity. So, my perspective on the sites at Fortivia is that they've got an incredible level of survival, and they absolutely should be scheduled and protected. And I suppose that the thing that, they are scheduled and protected sites, except for the fact that there's nothing can be done about the potato ploughing. And I do think that in England there's a slightly different regime in terms of protecting some crop mark sites and taking them out of agricultural processes and so on. But I mean, the thing about the comment that I made in the final chapter of this monograph 1 really related to the fact that I felt as if there wasn't actually much point in scheduling most crop mark sites because they're not actively managed or monitored or looked after. And there's a lot of scheduled crop mark sites. There's over 1,000, I think. I mean, I might be corrected. I know there's been reviews happening in the last few years, but actually, what you'd be better to do is to take 100 absolutely cracking crop mark sites and really properly protect them and take them out of ploughing altogether and manage those sites. And then the others, we just have to accept that processes will happen because farmers have to farm, life goes on and we can't protect everything. So I think it'd be better to protect fewer crop mark sites, but really protect them rather than try and have a scheduling process, which in effect is not really managing or protecting most of the sites because ploughing still continues. And this is not a criticism of HES because it's an incredibly difficult area of management in heritage business. And part of that is because these are sites that have such a low profile. So it brings us back round to that as a sort of circular thing because no one lies in front of a bulldozer to protect a crop mark site, but they will in front of a stone circle or in front of a visible monument. Well, maybe someone has, Sally, you're probably going to tell me now. Someone who has probably. But anyway, crop marks are great. Yeah, so let's think about how we protect them more in Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, what you showed, Kenny, is really that actually what this project invites us to do, whatever recommendations we think of the way forward, is it shows the importance of what may be very subtle, maybe even possibly quite ephemeral features, certainly difficult to understand possibly before they're excavated. And I think, Steve, I think you sent me a note here, some of the most important types of social events and activities leave light footprints. So, that's clearly what we're seeing here, and your work, reminds us of that. I'm going to move on. Thank you, Kenny. And pose a question to Tessa, if I may, or ask Tessa to kick off. I mean, I know, Tessa, you've got at least, 2 other monographs to come, aren't they? And one of them's got your name on it. But I mean, clearly what the project is characterized by is this kind of landscape perspective. And there's a figure somewhere here about that you've looked at 150 kilometers squared, over 50 excavations over 10 years. This is a really major project. And I just wondered what are the main ways in which the wider landscape perspective offered challenges and opportunities, and particularly, I suppose, with reference to the 2 volumes that have come out.
Yeah, so as mentioned by the other panelists, is that, Fortivit is a special place, a special landscape, a special point in the landscape, but to answer some of the questions like why Fortivit, you need to look beyond that place. So some of the challenges of doing that, especially with Fortivit, which has such different focuses of time and chronology as well, is what narratives and what paths that you take outside, when you go from Fortivit, which direction do you go, both in space and time? Because, as I say, we have different questions for that. And I know Kenny alluded to, a natural focus of looking at Ledketty and Dunning, for the early prehistory. But there was other opportunities for, other sorts of time, other sorts of focus. So some of the challenges really was the questions of where to do the same focus, because you can't do the same level of intensity of excavation everywhere. So it's that balance between leading by time and questions, very specific questions, dealing with each aspect of what was important for Fortivit and contrasting it within the local area, but also letting the landscape lead us in some ways to actually use methods to explore and to actually discover new things that we haven't known before, to be flexible with our research, and trying to balance both of those, which I think we did pretty well. We looked at, as I say, walk over landscape to try to see what is still surviving within the upland zone, just above the valley floor, but also comparing the things as I say, focus of things that were known about, such as the concentration of hill forts, or looking at chapel sites, which again, connecting to Fort Teviot as well, trying to string and work on these different threads together. So as I say, as you go out, these wider and different threads are always this challenge to balance. But as I say, there's different stories that come out and that can be, as I say, written about, all leading to and from Fort Teviot in different ways. And I think that's what, again, was very important, again, for each one of these focuses, like many layers, as I say, coming back into, why, asking the question, why Fort Teviot?
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm struck by the immersion that you all had in that landscape, and how you had very explicit research questions. And what, one of the things I particularly like about your volumes is how you discuss how those questions evolve and where they've got you to and where you think you should be going. And there is that sense of a journey that you've all gone on as you have worked and become familiar with that landscape. And that's
yeah, no, it's definitely something. And I think it probably will come in the question, Kevin Grant's question about the 10 years of the project itself. That's slightly different, but I think that comes into how this project is very different from many others, and will be, because of that time depth as well, and how we were flexible enough to think about these.
Thank you. And that's a really brilliant segue into the question I've got for Becky, which was SURF was really, the SURF project was really influential in setting up the of the Scottish Archaeology Survey strategy, which is Historic Environment Scotland launched in 2015. So I'm wondering how, with the publication of these two monographs and all the kind of learning that's coming from them, and what's to come as well, what are the learning points for the strategy, this really important document that we have in Scotland?
I think that the project itself and its products have always been very influential in the way we developed the strategy to start with, and they've always been an exemplar, and they will continue to be so. And in fact, the speed of publication as well, because that's 10 years worth of digging. You only stopped excavating a few years ago, and there are plenty of excavations that take 20 years plus to come to fruition. But I think one of the key elements for me is the fact that the way everything was embedded from the start. You've mentioned the research question, Sally. It's that embedding a research agenda with a field school, the full integration, the morphing of ideas as they come along, the trying to involve the local community and make sure that there's a legacy and a community benefit to that. And you trialed lots of different things during the process of those 10 seasons. There were lots of different options, from pop-up museums, all kinds of events and activities with local school children. You had a sort of a big dig with people digging in their gardens. I think we feel it's very much an exemplar of how you manage multi-season, multi-site, multidisciplinary research and training program. Because let's not forget, the hundreds of students and indeed community volunteers that were trained through this that are now working in Scotland and further afield. Some of them stayed in archaeology, some have left archaeology, but I think they've all got really strong memories of their time on that site and the legacy of that. And you've got numerous postgraduate research projects that have sprung out of it. So I think in terms of saying, yes, actually, we can do something really interesting on a landscape scale perspective and get something really valuable out of it that hopefully has a legacy for the local community that live there as well.
Yeah, and I think the teamwork dimension of the people that we're talking to here, but also the teamwork of everybody that's been involved, and the transferable skills that gives to students as whether they go to be archaeologists or go to be something else, is absolutely tremendous. Thank you, Becky. Well, I think with looking at the time, I'm going to lead on to my final question, and maybe several of you might be able to respond to that. So sorry, Steve, you can come back later. Making and employing fire is another theme that kind of comes through strongly when I looked at both of your findings, both the volumes. So I wondered what you wanted. You've kind of touched on this to a degree, but what do you want the legacies of your work to be further off beyond Scotland, or in Scotland indeed? And so how should your work light up archaeological thinking and practice elsewhere? And also you can think about, there's lots of things that you could be thinking about here. It might be how you conceived of and implemented your research, the nature of the findings that you had, but also the techniques, the things that you've done to disseminate, and indeed other things. So really this is like open house here. So who would like to go first? Steve?
I think one of the things which I want to draw attention to is the level of consistent support we've had. I mean, you know, I mean, it's been great having colleagues to support us. It's been great having our students, but it's also been really good having, if you like, the Scottish institutions kind of lining up behind us, and particularly Historic Scotland, Historic Environment Scotland. I don't know how they managed to square it to let us have funding for so many years, but you know, it's really important to be able to know that you're going to be able to do this, and you're going to be able to say, well, there's actually a dozen hill forts and they're quite different, and we're not really going to get our head around them unless we actually have a look at all of them. And you know, what we've got now from that is quite a rich array of stuff, which, you know, we wouldn't get the whole story if we just had looked at 2 or 3. So
yeah, and we don't have a discovery program in Scotland, so the opportunities for those kind of big projects with that major funding, that long commitment, don't routinely exist, do they? No,
and so you know, we kind of knew what we were hoping to find, but really, you know, if we were, you know, we could have just looked at the aerial photographs and said, gee whiz, they're amazing, and moved on. But if, as soon as you decide that you know, you really need to dig, then you also have to decide that you really don't know what you're going to find until you get stuck into it. So it's obviously that's why we do archaeology, and that's why archaeology is so exciting. But at the same time, it's, you know, we didn't really feel a sense of frustration about things closing down on us all that often. You know, the kind of that big support we were getting from people, you know, in the Royal Commission, while they were still there, they were helping us out with photographs and stuff like that. So it was, and the National Museum as well. So, you know, we were getting a lot of support, and it's, you know, created really nice relationships, which, you know, can, you know, survive now. And as you were mentioning, lots of careers were kicked off here, so that's all very gratifying as well, you know.
Yeah. But to rephrase my question, and maybe, thank you, Stephen, and maybe invite a response from somebody else, why should other people elsewhere, why should libraries around the world have your book? Why should people be reading it or be aware of your project? You've already hinted at some of the answers, I think, earlier on, but
I think it I think it tells maybe not a unique story, but a compelling story of the development of a nation almost, but taking its story back thousands of years, but not doing it in a sort of a blood and soil politically motivated way, but just actually saying, you know, that actually things happened in places because other things had happened before, and that was like, you know, and those were accrued layers through time, and that kind of process of literally and metaphorically digging into your past and to traditions and trying to make sense of what went before in the landscape without necessarily having any real connection to those things is quite a compelling story, I think, for our time as well, and one that is what excites me, because when in thinking about my monograph, you know, and the one that I wrote with Gordon on the prehistoric stuff, you know, it was never just about the prehistoric stuff. It was always thinking about, well, but then what happens next? What happened because of this happening in the Neolithic or in the Bronze Age? So, you know, for me, the 2 books offer a kind of a quite a compelling and really strong narrative that covers, you know, thousands of years, and there's not many places you can do that. So I think that's a really exciting thing.
Thank you. One last comment from somebody else before we move to questions. You and yeah.
There's also a methodological issue here. I mean, we were supported in having very large numbers of radiocarbon dates, and that turned out to be absolutely vital in establishing some of these things that were happening in the prehistoric monuments. We'd never have known unless we had taken lots of dates from lots of features. We wouldn't have found out that some of the Neolithic post holes were being reused in the early medieval period. Just unimaginable, really, that they were still sitting in the landscape as hollows and were reused at, you know, 3,000 years later. You know, so
what implications for other people working in similar sorts of landscapes?
Yes, that you need to date everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I just add in as well, just one thing quickly? I mean, one of the things that you've obviously talked about is that deep time and the fact that so many research projects in places focus on a particular period or something like that, whereas this is actually focusing on a landscape and the changing of that landscape through time. And also the fact that, yes, you have got the sculpture, you have got some standing remains, but so much of it is buried. And that's why libraries in other countries ought to have these books, is because we're all dealing with landscapes which have been, by and large, have had some form of agricultural improvement. And it just demonstrates just what a wealth of material there is to be learned from what's beneath the soil. And that is a reason to protect it. Obviously, methods of protection can be discussed, and Kenny's raised that, but that is another important feature of this project.
Yeah, and you go in to look at the Neolithic, but blimey, you're going to get some really interesting early medieval stuff, and you're still going to have to deal with that and be able to contextualize that. Okay, right, that's fantastic so far. Sorry that I've had to cut quite a lot of you short already, but we're now at the point where we're going to open the floor to questions, and I'm going to pass over to Neil. I think, Neil, you've been monitoring the questions, haven't you?
Yes, I have. Thank you. And I've sort of broken down some of the questions into four sort of different areas. So there's questions around management, there's questions around approach, there's questions around relevance, and then there's questions about archaeology, both in the theoretical approach, the techniques of archaeology, but also the experience of you as archaeologists. How did you feel about doing this? And so I really like the first question was, this was a 10-year project. Are we ever going to see the likes of it again? What was it like? What does that actually mean? Does that make it unique?
Not from me.
Sorry, Stephen, could you say that? Could you expand on that?
No, I was just going to say, I'm not going to start another 10-year project now, but it's, but it was, I mean, it was really unimaginable without such good collaboration. We just have a few people here, but we've had really good support, and I think it consumed people's lives for 10 years over the summers, just trying to get all the vehicles hired, get the accommodation, get all the people. And I mean, it wasn't continuous 10 years. That would be really unimaginable, but it was, the actual ability to do it really depended on having such good colleagues. And I'm sure that's down to good luck as much as good management.
Am I right in also thinking that the way that we structured the funding was in 5-year, so it was sort of 2 5-year projects initially as well, which I think possibly helps to get a 10-year one, because I think if somebody goes to a funder and saying, I've got a 10-year project, very few funders are going to do that. So it's about breaking it down and then making those justifications for why you then need to extend it for a further period. 4 to 5-year projects are more common. 10 years are now increasingly rare, but I think you've demonstrated the value of it.
Yeah, so we did kind of conceive of it as in two different chunks, because in order to fit that kind of that kind of managerial context. But each year we were, or until the very end, or towards the end, we were kind of conjuring up a kind of program and justification for each year, but within the context of knowing that there was a willingness to support us, and a kind of a commitment to the idea that of looking at the big picture, and recognizing that the big picture would take quite a while to actually work our way through.
Brilliant. I suppose the one thing that I get from that is having a really dynamic funding package that actually really helps, not trying to do everything all at once. For me, something else that actually the people who lived in this landscape would have lived in it for longer than 10 years. So why, as archaeologists, are we so horrified about being in that landscape for that time? Maybe we might learn something from that. As we grow older, our reflections change, really important. And then I think my other question about that whole thing is, where else might you go in Scotland to do something similar? You don't have to answer that one, but it's a really good, or I suppose that comes out of
really
my
need a young person to answer.
Tessa.
No, I think, I mean, following on from what Steve mentioned, I mean, it's great that we had support. We all, in terms of HES and colleagues, and there's a momentum with, you know, a certain amount of momentum with 10-year project, because we also had lots of students supporting us and lots of, as I say, young energy within the project. But it's hard, and we were warned from the beginning that surf is going to be hard if you sustain this for a long time, that motivation and will fall, you know, as it does for a long time. So 10 years may not seem like a long time to live on a place, and it goes by fairly quickly in some regards. But to sustain that, there is that challenge to keep it going. And luckily we had so many different colleagues willing to take on, you know, the mantle to be the next, you know, focus of a project. So there was lots of things that were passed along. And I think you need that sort of infrastructure in place in order to maintain that, because some people go and you have to adapt, or some people move on. And that's, you know, luckily there's enough people that remained within the project to continue to do that. So to envision doing a 10-year project again, because it's not just 10 years, because it's also, and though there was summer focuses, we had, you know, springtime, there was post-excavation happening all the time, there's post-excavation afterwards, and even the publication, even though it may be relatively quick, it seemed like a long time to even get these, you know, beautiful volumes out, and there's still more to be done. So it's not even an end of the project yet. So 10 years, it means plus. 10 years was 20 plus. So to contemplate right now to doing another same thing again can be quite daunting. So I don't think you can just jump right in there to think of, oh, where am I going to go for another 10 years or somewhere else? I think maybe a project might have to find you in order to do that after these experiences. But I don't know what other people may think about their future prospects.
Okay, brilliant, Tessa, thanks. So my next sort of grouping of questions I'm going to throw at you are around relevance. Okay, so there's a brilliant question there about if you take from the prehistoric to the medieval, what resonance in that landscape would the medieval people have felt from the prehistoric? And then I'd like to roll that forwards. What resonance is there in that landscape for people of today? You've created 2 extraordinary volumes of material, but how do you experience that in that place today? Which sort of then jumps you straight into some of those management questions and those management challenges. But just starting on that, can you, because you've looked at this transition effectively over this amazing time period, could you just reflect on those relevance issues?
I mean, I noticed also was a question from Susan Greeny about what physically would have been there for medieval people to respond to, and I think that one of the things that is really clear to us is how enduring things are, even relatively ephemeral features. When you don't have modern industrial scale ploughing and agriculture, holes in the ground hang around for a long time. And you know, I think that even the post holes and the hollows of the palisaded enclosure were still enough of an obstacle for a medieval or a post-medieval trackway to skirt past where that monument was. So I think that there would have been quite substantial physical traces, banks and ditches and hollows that would have been interpretable on the ground as being of certain shapes and forms. And I think that would have certainly been something that would have drawn those pesky medieval hole diggers who were indeed amateur archaeologists of the very worst kind, who were digging and robbing those prehistoric sites out. You can tell I'm scarred by this.
Not reporting on it either.
No, exactly. No, I still haven't published them.
How do you know they weren't reporting on it? Sorry, we're going to get done.
Can I just say the relevance thing, you know, is difficult because it's not a densely populated landscape. It's people, you know, it's largely agricultural. The village itself is tiny. The main road is, you know, a few miles away. So most people just see a road sign and zip by it. So it's hard in that sense. I think one of the things that's happened, because we were there, the Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust incorporated it in a kind of landscape improvement program they were working on. So there's actually an amazing sandstone cross which has been produced, and it's kind of inspired by the Pictish sculpture, but it's, you know, it's a very respectful thing, and it's a big piece of stone. So it kind of creates a presence and a kind of historic tangibility, which otherwise, as we've been talking about, is really hard to appreciate, because it has been so heavily damaged. And I think there's always going to be a problem with the invisibility of this site because of the its more recent history. But one of the very gratifying things is that Perth Museum is in the middle of a very major redisplay and rethinking of their whole collections, and this story is going to be a central part of it. So this is going to actually have a kind of long, if you like, institutional, educational presence and visibility, for another, I guess really we're buying another generation of visibility in a major museum in the neighborhood. So it's, I think, it's difficult with this kind of site. It's not Stonehenge. It isn't. You can't trip on it. So you have to come up with other ways of doing it. So hopefully these will help.
Yeah, and could I just add that, I mean, we were very aware from the beginning that there isn't anything to show people, and that's one of the reasons we commissioned these marvelous illustrations from David Simon to give these imaginative reconstructions of the sites at different periods, so that people would have something to grasp really about the sites.
I mean, I think that's really, really nice. I mean, that was my question about how your work inspired the art and what relationship there is there again with the use of art. How important do you see that in actually getting across what this site might have been like? And then my other question around exactly that thing about it in a sense being plowed flat and you don't see anything, is actually understanding where those farmsteads are and what context they actually have today as a conversation in. Why were people attracted to this landscape? Is it because it was a good landscape to cultivate early on, a good landscape to actually live in? So actually it's still highly productive. Kenny, I would actually challenge, the reason why the farming is intensive is it's actually a good place to do intensive farming. So that's our conversation into those people. And certainly that's an experience I've had in Yorkshire, on the Yorkshire Wolds, where you get the same density of stuff, but you get the same number of people actually in very remote places. So interesting how you've talked about there that movement of people almost to Perth, and how do they bring the story back again? But again, just so really just there, reflect on the artwork and the importance of that. Anyone want to come in on that?
We were really fortunate. David Simons has a long pedigree of doing this, and I wouldn't say he's obsessed, but he's very meticulous, and he spent a lot of time on the site, took lots of photographs. He spent a lot of time with our plans. He was really trying to get his head around that and to come up with plausible ways of representing it, and that level of participation engagement was really, again, it was facilitated by Historic Environment Scotland being prepared to invest a lot of money in that, because it is important means of getting that, visualizing what we were doing, and it's essential for providing a kind of good museum display, one that grips people. You have to be able to see people and imagine how they were in that landscape, so that you can understand the kind of bits and pieces we have to work with. So he built models that he then used to draw, so he would get things in the right scale. And anyway, so
his productions are part of the biography of the whole landscape as well now, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
I hate to say it, Nick, we're out of time, aren't we?
We are out of time. We could go on, but that was absolutely fascinating. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. There were some really nice ones about cultivation and scheduling in there, which is a very, very long and tricky story. and could be an entirely separate discussion all by itself. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I hope you got a lot out of that. Please do buy the books if you haven't got them already. I think this is absolutely one of those landscapes to visit. To me, what you actually even just get from the publications is that landscape must be the most amazing bowl when you actually go into it. To have it ringed by those highlands must be absolutely fascinating. And to me, there's something in that. So, you know, Tessa, what you're talking about, that wider landscape, absolutely fascinating. We will email everybody sending you out again the links to the discount codes for you. I would really like to thank Sally and the rest of the panelists for their time and talking about it, and for their 10-year commitment to archaeology. And I think what you've produced in here for the people of Scotland is really fantastic. So again, thanks to Historic Environment Scotland. Clearly the funding is absolutely important. Do check out the books a bit more. Go and visit when you're allowed to. Obviously, lockdown rules allowing. And I just wanted to say to everyone again, thank you very, very much for joining us. And I hope you enjoyed your evening.
Can I just quickly thank the CBA for being such patient publishers? And I also thank Sally for wrangling us so elegantly.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thanks all.